You worked hard this week. You kept your head down, got through everything that was thrown at you, and by Friday you were done, completely spent. And somewhere in that exhaustion, a voice showed up, quiet, reasonable, entirely convincing. And it said the three words that have probably cost you more money than any other sentence you have ever believed. You deserve this. A meal you did not plan for. A purchase you had been holding off on. Something that was not in the budget and somehow ended up in your hands anyway. Because you had a hard week and you earned it, and what is the point of working this hard if you cannot enjoy the money you make? And that logic is so clean, so human, so completely understandable that questioning it almost feels cruel. But here is what that voice never tells you. It shows up every single week, not occasionally, not when something truly extraordinary happened. Every week, because every week has a reason. Every week has a moment where the exhaustion is real enough and the desire for relief is strong enough that I deserve this arrives exactly on cue, reaches into your financial future, and pulls something forward into today. And your financial future gets a little smaller every single time it does. Before we go deeper, subscribe to Sticky Finance. What this channel does is find the exact things that are quietly working against your money and drag them into the light. And this one has been hiding in plain sight for most people's entire adult lives. Let's be precise about what we are actually talking about. Because most people hear, I deserve this spending, and think it means reckless overspending. It is not. The most financially damaging version of this pattern looks completely normal from the outside. I deserve this. Spending is not the same as enjoying your money. Enjoying your money is intentional. You plan for it. You allocated a specific amount for it. You spent it without guilt because it was already accounted for in the bigger picture. That is healthy. That is what part of your money is genuinely for. I deserve this. Spending is different in one critical way. It is reactive. It is not triggered by a plan, but by an emotional state, usually stress, exhaustion, frustration, or the specific kind of pressure that builds up when you've been disciplined for a while and the restraint itself becomes its own source of tension. It is spending as emotional release. The purchase is not really the point. The relief is the point. The purchase is just the fastest available vehicle to get there. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in personal finance. Because if your spending is serving a psychological function, if it is the primary way you manage stress, reward effort, or decompress after difficulty, then no budget will ever fully hold. You cannot cut a coping mechanism out of your life with a spreadsheet. The emotional pressure has to go somewhere. And until you build an alternative release valve, it will always find its way back to your bank account. This is where things get dangerous. Here is how deep this pattern actually runs. Deeper than most people realize until they start watching it closely. The I deserve this voice does not just appear after genuinely hard weeks. It appears after hard days, after difficult conversations, after long commutes when the train was delayed and you were standing the whole way, after someone spoke to you dismissively at work and you held your composure when everything in you wanted to react, after you said no to something you wanted and the restraint itself built up enough internal pressure that the release becomes not just tempting, but inevitable. It appears when you have been good with money for a few weeks and the discipline starts to feel indistinguishable from punishment. When the budget that was supposed to feel empowering starts to feel like a cage and your mind begins constructing a case, entirely convincingly, with completely legitimate evidence, for why one exception is not just acceptable, but actively deserved. And critically, it appears in a very specific emotional window. Not when you are calm and planning. Not when you are rested and thinking clearly about your financial future. In the exact moment when emotional need is highest and rational resistance is lowest. Which is precisely why the morning version of you can build a perfect budget and the evening version of you breaks it. Same person, completely different emotional state, completely different decision. Think about the last time you spent money on something unplanned. Not an emergency, just something you wanted in a particular moment. Think about where you were, what kind of day it had been, what the emotional temperature of that specific moment felt like. The purchase made complete sense in that moment in a way it probably would not have made sense 12 hours earlier, when you were calm and forward-thinking. That gap between the planned version of you and the emotionally activated version of you, that gap is exactly where the drain lives. And for most people, it is open every single week. But here is the catch, and this is the part that almost nobody in personal finance is willing to be honest about. Though I deserve this voice is not wrong. You do work hard. The effort is genuinely real. The exhaustion is real. The desire for something good in direct exchange for something difficult is one of the most fundamentally human experiences that exists, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. The problem is not the feeling. The problem is what the feeling has been trained to reach for. Because somewhere along the way, through advertising, through culture, through the way consumption was modeled around you as you grew up, your brain learned that the correct response to deserving something is to buy something. That reward equals purchase. That the way you honor your effort is through spending. And that association is so deeply embedded in modern consumer life that most people never pause to question whether it is actually true. You did not arrive at this connection naturally. It was constructed around you. The entire architecture of consumer culture is built on one psychological insight, that emotional states create spending triggers, and that if you can reliably produce the right emotional state, the spending follows automatically. Every advertisement that has ever told you to treat yourself, reward yourself, or celebrate yourself with a purchase was engineering exactly this response. The hard week creates the emotional state. The emotional state activates the voice. The voice produces the purchase. The industry collects. It works not because people are weak or undisciplined, but because the emotional logic underneath it is genuinely sound. You did work hard. You did earn something. The manipulation is only in what that something has to be. This is where things shift completely. There's a concept called hedonic adaptation. It means the emotional lift from any purchase fades far faster than you expect, faster than the rational mind predicts when it is standing in the moment of wanting. The thing you bought to make yourself feel better stops delivering that feeling almost immediately, usually within days, sometimes within hours, sometimes for smaller purchases before you have even left the building. And then the emotional need that triggered the purchase is still there, slightly dulled by the temporary satisfaction, but fundamentally unresolved. The exhaustion did not leave with the transaction. The stress did not dissolve. The frustration of the difficult week did not disappear because you bought something in response to it. It was numbed briefly and then it returned, which means the trigger is still active, which means the voice comes back, which means the next hard day produces the exact same sequence, the same emotional pressure building, the same convincing internal argument, the same purchase, the same brief relief, the same return to baseline. This is the mechanism behind lifestyle creep, behind persistent impulse spending, behind the specific and exhausting experience of watching your income grow year after year while your financial position somehow fails to grow with it. It is not a discipline problem. It is not an income problem. It is a reward loop problem. A loop where the behavior that provides temporary relief also prevents the actual resolution of the underlying need. And reward loops do not respond to budgets, because budgets address what you spend while the loop is operating entirely at the level of why you spend. The cycle continues not because you are weak, but because the relief, temporary as it is real. And real relief is extraordinarily difficult to give up without something concrete to replace it. Let me make this visible in numbers, because the abstract eventually needs to land somewhere real. Assume the I deserve this trigger activates twice a week, which is actually conservative for most people operating under regular work stress. Assume the average unplanned spend is modest each time. 2 unplanned purchases a week adds up to roughly $250 a month, possibly more. Nearly 3,000 over the course of a year. That is before you account for the larger versions. The purchase that gets justified after a particularly brutal stretch, the upgrade that feels earned because you've been so disciplined recently, the bigger exception that arrives precisely when the pattern was finally starting to hold. 3,000 a year, invested consistently and left alone, compounds into something genuinely significant over a decade. Not theoretical wealth you will never see. Real, measurable options creating money. Money that could represent the difference between being dependent on next month's income and having enough buffer that work becomes a choice rather than a requirement. Instead, it bought relief. Temporary relief. At a permanent. So here is what actually changes this. Not what sounds motivating at a surface level. What works at the level where the pattern actually lives. The first step is to separate the deserving from the spending completely. You genuinely worked hard. You genuinely deserve a reward. Acknowledge that fully, without guilt, without diminishing the effort. And then ask a different question. What would actually feel like a reward that is not a purchase? Real rest instead of distracted rest. A conversation that replenishes you. An experience that costs nothing but attention. Something physical that releases tension without a transaction. The goal is not to remove reward from your life. It is to break the automatic equation that says reward must equal purchase. That equation was given to you. It is not permanent. The second step is to build a guilt-free spending allocation directly into your budget every single month. A fixed amount, whatever you can genuinely afford, that is yours to spend on anything at all with no justification required. The psychological power of this is enormous. When the I deserve this voice shows up and there's already money designated for exactly that purpose, the purchase stops feeling like a failure of discipline. It becomes a planned expenditure. The emotional charge dissolves. The budget does not break because the purchase was inside the plan the whole time. The third step is to introduce a pause between the trigger and the purchase. Not a permanent no, just a gap. 24 hours between the impulse and the action. Most I deserve this purchases do not survive a 24-hour delay. Not because the want disappears, but because the emotional state that made the purchase feel necessary has shifted by then. The depleted evening version of you activated the impulse. The rested morning version of you gets to decide whether to follow through. This one structural change, applied consistently, redirects a significant amount of money back toward where you actually want it to go. The fourth step is to start tracking not what you spent, but why. 1 month. Every unplanned purchase. Record the emotional trigger that preceded it in the hour before. Not to create shame around spending. To see the pattern clearly enough to address it at the source. Once you can identify the specific emotional states that reliably produce spending for you, stress from particular situations, exhaustion from particular demands, the specific feeling of having been strong for too long, you can build a specific and intentional response to each one that does not reach for your wallet. The fifth step is the deepest one and the one that makes everything else sustainable. Change what I deserve this actually points toward. You work hard. You make real effort. That effort deserves a return that is actually proportional to it. Not a meal that disappears in 20 minutes, but a financial position that means the next hard week does not have to be funded by anxiety and depletion. The effort you have been putting in for years deserves better than temporary relief at permanent cost. Redirecting I deserve this toward your future self, toward the options and the freedom and the security you're building, is not deprivation. It is the most accurate version of giving yourself what you actually earned. Here is the turn. The I deserve this voice is not the enemy. It is an accurate report from a tired person who genuinely earned something good. The problem was never the feeling, and it was never the deserving. It was what the feeling had been trained to reach for, and who trained it to reach there. You built a life under real pressure. You showed up when it was hard. You kept going when stopping would have been easier. That is real. That matters. And that kind of sustained, costly effort deserves a reward that actually lasts. Not a moment of relief that costs you a decade of compound growth, but a foundation that means the next hard thing in your life is easier to survive because you built something while you were surviving this one. The voice will keep coming. Every week. That is not going to change, and it should not, because the effort is real and the deserving is real. What can change is what it reaches for when it arrives. If this found you at exactly the right moment, share it with someone who needs to hear it before the next hard week gets to them first. And subscribe to Sticky Finance. Every single week, we go deeper into the conversations about money that nobody else is willing to have out loud. We will see you in the next one.